Okay, and for everybody who's joining us on the webinar, we should be live streaming on Facebook very shortly. And hi everyone, my name is Ellie Reese. I'm the Program and Outreach Coordinator for the Woodstock Land Conservancy. Welcome to Pollinator Garden Talk, Planning Your Garden Q&A with Experts. Our evening presentation is brought to you by the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway Project. We started this project to combat the drastic loss of pollinating species. This loss is due mainly to many factors, including the loss of pollinators' habitats. We need your help planting native pollinator-friendly plants in your yards to grow food, shelter, and breeding places to support pollinators. To ensure the success of our project, we're offering advice via our website, weekly Friday email blasts, and a series of webinars with experts. The Woodstock Pollinator Pathway Project is a collaboration between Woodstock Land Conservancy, the Catskill Center, Woodstock Transition, the Woodstock Environmental Commission, and community member partners. For tonight's discussion, I'm joined by ecological gardening experts Angela Sissone and Del Orlovsky, invasive species expert Dan Snider, and moderating the conversation, we have Maxanne Resnick, Executive Director of Woodstock Land Conservancy. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'd like to get started with our experts briefly speaking about native or ecological planting, analyzing the site conditions of your current landscape. Understanding your project plans can begin with small steps to a larger scale project. And lastly, we want to share with you which invasive species to be on the lookout for and what you might do about them. I'd like to introduce our experts. First is Angela Sissone. Angela has been involved in ecological landscaping using native plants for over 15 years. After receiving a degree in landscape design from the Conway School in Massachusetts, she developed a special passion for wildflower meadows and enjoys helping others who are interested in learning about native meadows and how they support pollinators. Next is Del Orlovsky. Del received his graduate degree in sustainability and land planning at the Conway School in Massachusetts. He's a consultant for landscape architects, wetland scientists, engineers both in New York State and Connecticut with a focus on mitigation, restoration, and stormwater management using native plants. And Dan Snider. Dan is Field Projects Manager with the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership, a program of the Catskill Center for Conservation and Development. His work focuses on educating about, surveying for, and managing invasive species throughout the Catskill watershed. Dan attended the University of Maryland at College Park, where he received a degree in ecology and evolution. And now I'd like to give our experts a little time to introduce themselves and share some key points they would like to focus on this evening. We'll start with Angela.
Thanks, Ellie. After the previous webinar and the film, there was a lot of feedback from people who expressed an interest in planting pollinators, but a lot of them lacked gardening experience or lacked experience with natives. Some people were expressing feeling overwhelmed by all the unfamiliar information about natives and pollinators, and were really at a loss as to how to begin. My advice is to begin small and continue to learn. First point, if you lack experience but are eager to get started this growing season, take baby steps. Start with a small project. Second point, well, starting with a small project, spend this season learning about your landscape. Sorry. Your own on-site growing conditions, because even if you're just growing in containers, you still have to consider factors such as sun and moisture. If you can keep in mind that you don't have to learn everything all at once, that you have all season, it can help prevent that feeling of being overwhelmed. If you're trying to learn about what's already growing there, that can take a full growing season anyway to get an accurate picture, because different plants species dominate at different times of the season. You can also learn a great deal and get a head start in that process if you have a site visit from a professional to do a site analysis of your landscape. I think Del is going to talk more about site analysis as well, but I can't stress enough how important it is to understand your own site conditions. It's the foundation of any project. Third point, document. Write down what you learn over the season and use that information to inform a big picture, a master plan approach. In other words, if you want to plant a tree or a hedgerow or a meadow or put in a water garden, don't consider doing that in isolation. Think of those smaller projects as being components or phases of an overall plan. That plan is based on your desires and your site conditions. But back to the getting started. Start small and take it one step at a time, which is how we learn. There's a very useful resource on the Pollinator website, and that's the pollinator-pathway.org. There's a free downloadable booklet titled Native Plants for the Small Yard. You could Google that title as well, Native Plants for the Small Yard. The booklet has several design templates with plant lists and instructions. Projects which range all the way from the very small, such as container garden or mailbox garden, up to a backyard patio. Another small project could be to suspend mowing just a portion of your lawn to see if any desirable plants emerge. If you do this, I recommend mowing the edge and mowing a pathway through your trial meadow. Mowing edges and paths demonstrate that this is an intentional project and it's not just laziness on your part. Also, by getting out there and mowing a path, you're more likely to notice any changes or any new plants growing in the unmowed area. So to summarize, start with a small, maybe just a tiny project, spend the season learning about your landscape and your unique conditions, and finally, use what you learn to make a plan. Even if the plan is to do as little as possible to your landscape, that's still a plan, and it might be a very good plan for the pollinators. Back to you, Ellie. Where's Ellie?
I'm here, sorry. Next,
Oh.
I'd like to introduce Del. Why don't you share with us what you'd like to focus on tonight?
Well, I think I'm going to be speaking about the people that are more experienced gardeners, maybe even expert gardeners. And now I want to challenge you to upgrade your site analysis, especially. What we're looking at is the soil and the sun and moisture on your property, and also the existing plants that are on there. If you don't know them, start learning more about them. Even the weeds will tell you what's actually growing on what the conditions are. They're almost like soil tests for you. You know, if you see a rush that's growing there, or even a jewelweed. You know, I've seen this happen on people's properties right next to their house, and it's obviously there's a problem with the gutter that's leaking, and which if they have a stone basement, stone foundation, they're going to have some leakage in there, you know, and so, you know, things like that. Look at the landscape overall. And also in terms of soil testing, I just took a real quick, this is a real easy way of doing it. I did this about 5 o'clock today, and I took this, this is a kombucha jar. What's nice about it is that it's nice and straight. And what's happening here, it hasn't settled out. I would let this sit for about 24 hours. And what you want is to have, what's going to happen is that after you shake it with water, put about this much 3/4 of soil and fill it up with the rest with water, shake it really, really well and let it sit. And then what will happen is all the large material will settle. You got sand, silt, and clay will form. And then organic matter will probably be floating on the top. So you can have to figure out the percentage of that. So you have the sand is a certain amount, you have the silt and the clay. And if you have a clay area, even if it's on an upland area and you have no water on there, you're going to have a lot of, you might want to shift your plant palette to more wetland plants. You're going to have more success with that. So it might be a perch water table in that case. So by doing a site analysis like that, you can understand what's going on. I also would, you have to also look at what kind of environmental stresses and what kind of critters are coming to your property. The deer has to be looked at, you know, and rabbits and woodchucks. And so you know, that might change the whole palette. So my point is that really focus on the patterns that are happening on the landscape too. Look at the water and the wind on your property. How is it moving through that? And those will offer ideas in terms of natural patterns. If you're doing a meadow, you'll create a whole swath of a certain plant that will be in a wetland area, and drier areas might be upland. The problem areas, whether they be a slope, very rocky or sandy, or they might be even a wetland. These are not problems. These are really opportunities to grow certain plants. Instead of changing the landscape, try to learn what the landscape is actually speaking to you. Ask, you know, how is that, what kind of plants that I can grow in the soil without changing it. And you'll create a more resilient landscape. And that's the whole point of the pollinator pathway, is to create biodiversity. And the purpose of doing that is to create a more resilient landscape, one that's going to be able to work with the changes of the that are coming. There's no doubt that there's going to be climate change is going to be an issue, and insects and plants will change over time. So my one quote that I remember early in my studies was Buckminster Fuller, and he said, when I'm working on a problem, I never think of I never think of beauty. When I'm working on a problem, I never think of beauty. I think only on how to solve the problem. But when I am finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it is wrong. So the idea, a lot of people think they want to create this beautiful landscape. Think of the function first, function, and then the aesthetics afterwards, the beauty of it. And if it's not beautiful, you know it's wrong. Go back to the drawing board. So the idea is to really understand through site analysis how to use your landscape, and you'll have a one that's more resilient and be able to give you a lot of joy for many years without a lot of input. By changing the landscaping, you're actually causing more maintenance in that sense, because you have to keep it up. So understand what the soil is, understand the sun, you know, watch the sun throughout the whole year. Where is it coming up? Where is it going down? What kind of sun is, you know, the shade of the, and the quality of the shade. You know, if you have a Norway maple, invasive, it has big leaves and it's going to create a heavy shade, and it has other problems as well that Dan will probably talk about later. So, and also understand how you're going to, in terms of doing the analysis, not only the plants, but understand the whole family, how they want to use the space. And then from there, all those components can be put together into a beautiful landscape that you really enjoy for many years. So that's what I have to say for now.
Thanks so much, Del. Now we'll move on to Dan Snider.
So I'm here to answer your guys' questions about invasive species. And before we get started with the Q&A, I just wanted to make a couple points about invasives. First, that invasive species do lower the quality of pollinator habitat. Invasive species, invasive plants have characteristics that allow them to outcompete native species in the same area, and they eventually exclude the native plants completely. This removes crucial host plants for pollinating insects, and then the birds that rely on those insects' caterpillars also don't visit the site. Some pollinating insects can actually confuse invasive plants for their host plants and lay their eggs on the wrong species, and then their caterpillars can't complete development. So it's important to control invasive plants where you can to help promote the spread of pollinator positive habitat. And controlling invasive species is really achievable goal. It doesn't have to be one and done in a year. It can be a long-term commitment with just advancing every year. And a lot of invasive control projects are going to take multiple years. So just, before you get started, adjust your expectations that you might be at it for, 3 to 6 years, or maybe in perpetuity. There might be an infestation that you can't eradicate because the site isn't super accessible to you, or there might be a source population of the invasive species nearby that isn't being controlled. Containment is a great goal to have, where you just sort of corral the invasive species and control the edges of the infestation where it'll spread from, and then you move inward toward the core infestation year after year. It can be a slow process and still be successful. But of course, the easiest way to prevent invasive species introductions is to prevent them instead of reacting after the fact, after they're established. And there are some really good resources for knowing what is invasive, even though it's offered for sale at some nurseries. The New York State DEC has a list of prohibited and regulated species on their website. You can also talk to your local PRISM, Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. For the Catskills, that's my program, CRISP. You can also talk to your CCE Master Gardener networks and check out the PlantWise NY brochure online. All right, Ellie, back to you.
Ellie, do you want me to jump
Thanks so
in
much,
now
Dan. Now
for the Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely,
All right.
Maxanne. Now for Maxanne Resnick, WLC Executive Director, will be moderating our question and answer portion of the program. Thank you so much, Maxanne.
So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. We're thrilled about the interest in this project and your participation, and we're trying to do what we can to help you be successful with it and our community to be successful with it. So we did receive a few questions in advance, and so I'm going to turn to those. If you do have a question that you'd like to have answered, just go into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and just type in the question, and we'll look to get that answered by one of our panelists. So let me just start with Angela. There's a question about meadow. How can I make an existing meadow more pollinator and bird friendly?
Okay, well, I can tell you what I've done with my meadows. And for example, you can, depending upon the size of the meadow, and I'm assuming this is going to be something of a reasonable scale, maybe up to a few thousand square feet, not several acres, for example. So a meadow that's, say, the size of a yard. If it's that size, then what I've done in the past is dig up garden plants from other locations that maybe they're too big for the other locations, or I may buy some full-size garden plants and actually insert them right in the middle. If you do this, you want to make sure that you dig enough space around the plant, because the meadow is already established, and the plant itself has to establish, and you're going to have to maintain it throughout that first season, water it and watch it, and make sure the meadow itself doesn't encroach on it too much. And hopefully by the second season, this plant will be established. I've done this. This is particularly effective if you have some of your more aggressive plants like Joe Pye weed and maybe some of the retibitas. But in any case, sunny, meadow type plants will do well under those circumstances, just inserting them. If you go with plugs, that's going to be a lot more work and maintenance to insert them into an established meadow. It's still doable, but I recommend going with plants, especially if the meadow is small enough.
Thank you, Angela. Dell, I have a question about site prep. Someone asked, I have an existing flower bed that is in front of my house that is 6 foot deep by 20 feet wide. I am going to be adding another 3 feet to the depth, making the finished bed 9 feet by 20 feet. Once I remove the grass, and then in parentheses, okay, weeds, what is the best way to prepare the new portion of the bed for transplanting some existing perennials and adding new ones?
Well, I would first, that size, it'd be nice to have some stepping stones in the landscape. 6 feet is pretty, it's doable to be able to manage that, but a 9 foot width is going to be a little more challenging. So it'd be nice to put some stones that seem like they fit into the landscape. And the other thing is, I would also keep things if they're the 3 feet are be in the lawn or close to it. So keep the plants a little lower so you can enjoy the other flowers in front. So observe which ones are planted in the throughout the landscape, and then add things that are appropriate for that one section there, that's whatever the conditions are for your landscape. So and just think in terms of throughout the whole season, through spring, summer, winter, and fall, and all those seasons. You make sure that you have some color and variety, and that is, so there's food available for the wildlife. So
thank you, Dell. Okay, Dan Snider, you're up.
Thank you.
Dan, I would love to hear some tips on getting rid of invasive wild chervil. If mowing and digging up aren't options, is it best to cut down just before flowering or once it has flowered but not gone to seed?
So if the site isn't super accessible for digging, you can cut the flower heads off. You can cut it back before it flowers too, but it will it may flower again. Either way, it's less likely, I'd say, if you do it after it flowers before it seeds, but you're going to want to keep an eye on it either way.
Thank you, Dan. Angela, there's a question on plants. I'm starting some of the plants for my pollinator garden from seed, and notice there's one that requires 70 days of cold, moist stratification. Is there a way of speeding up that process? And then also, to satisfy the moist stratification requirement, I learned that I can place seeds between 2 wet paper towels in a Ziploc in the fridge until they sprout. At that point, could I transfer them to a small peat pot until it's time to place them? And then the peat pot would allow, the peat pot would allow transplanting without disturbing the roots. Or do pollinator flowers generally have to be planted in place?
So this looks like a pretty ambitious project for somebody. I was impressed. I have started native plants from seed, and my go-to source for that is the Wild Seed Project, which this questioner can Google. Wild Seed Project, it's in Maine. That's a nonprofit organization, but I would also recommend going to Prairie Moon Nursery and calling them directly with this question. These people grow the seeds, sell the product, and if I had these questions, I would just pick up the phone and call them. they'll talk to you for a long time, and they'll really be able to pick their brain. So that's what I would do in this particular case, rather than try to ferret out, because she also has a long list of different species here. And I have to say, it's a pretty ambitious project. And she's going through a lot of work, and definitely call those folks at Prairie Moon, or also Prairie Nursery, but my go-to source for just getting questions answered is Prairie Moon.
Thank you, Angela.
I have can I add?
Del, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, Del.
Yeah,
You wanted to add?
I wanted to add to that. I had a lot of experience with seed plantings. If you're doing a decent size, even a whole front yard or something like that, I would wait until the late fall. We're talking like October, maybe even in November, but late October would be good. And do a dormant seeding. Basically what that is that you have to prepare the soil so there's good soil seed contact, and then cover the seed so that it's not going to be eaten up right away. And then it's going to stay dormant. But what you'll have is all this snow and rain all through the rest of the fall into the winter and early spring. And I've had more success with that, and it requires less maintenance. If you started in the spring, you're chancing a lot of things. There's a lot of wheat seeds in the beds already, and you're just going to have a more challenging time getting that going. So
I would also add, that's how I've always done my meadows, is in the fall, and with the dormant seeding. I got the impression that this person was doing pot seeding, but
right.
It's I think they should call, because they're already into their project. So
yeah, definitely.
Okay, Dan, this is one for you. Dan, someone writes, I am going on a mint jag and understand some are fairly invasive. Is there any limitations on what should be done with mountain mint? I have both hairy and clustered mountain mint I plan to add to the front hill of my house.
I think mountain mint is a native, right?
Yes.
And there's a difference between invasive and a weed. And an invasive has to be foreign to the area, or non-native, doesn't naturally occur in that area, which is part of why it's such a big deal to control invasives when you're managing somewhere for pollinator habitat, because they don't provide as good food to the pollinating insects, the caterpillars, which means there's less food for the birds as well. So I'll send it over to the native gardeners for comments on if the front hill of their house is appropriate.
I
do have I love mint, actually. So can I answer that? Yeah. So
go ahead,
there's a lot of different kinds of mint, and things like peppermint. Yeah, peppermint and spearmint and things like that. There is a wild mint that is less aggressive, but the peppermint will spread quickly. But there are a lot of native plants that you don't think of them as mints, but they're really excellent pollinator plants. Anise hyssop is one of them. That's in the mint family. Wild bergamot is another one that does very well at deer resistant. A lot of these mint native mint plants are also resistant to to deer because of the fragrance. Plants produce certain chemicals in them to ward off certain animals from eating too much of them, and that's probably why they produce these these aromatic oils in them to ward off. But human beings are able to ingest these and use them for all sorts of things, and they're beautiful plants, and they're very good pollinators. So stick with
I
the
would
native
have to
ones.
agree
The
with all
native-
that. Yeah,
Sorry.
I would
Angela,
have to agree with all that.
Go ahead.
All the native mints are great pollinators. I can't think of any native mints that I don't see pollinators all over. And the culinary mint, a lot of people will use that in gardens as well. And I'm not even sure if that one's invasive. It's pretty aggressive, but it's also pretty easy to control. So I don't see mints in general as being a problem. What was the person's question about mint?
I think he was just interested. Hang on, I have to find it again. Were there limitations with mountain mint, and that because he has some both hairy and clustered, and he wanted to add it on the front hill of his house.
Okay.
All right,
Stick
well,
to
let's,
native.
Dan, there are two, go ahead, Dal, sorry.
Stick
Del,
to
did you want
native
to say something?
plants. You're gonna. Yes, I just in terms of mint, just stick to the native. That's basically what Angela and I both agree on as well. So that's the only thing I want to emphasize.
Thank you.
Or
Dan?
contain. Going to do the other one.
Okay, Dan Snider. There's actually two people who have asked about jumping worms. So Dan, if you can help define for people what this is. The question is, what would you do about jumping worms? Are they beneficial in any way, or should they be eliminated whenever and wherever possible? And what are the best methods for finding and disposing of them?
Yeah,
Dan Snider.
So crazy jumping worms, you might hear them referred to as amynthus, are really aggressive invasive earthworms. There are actually 3 species of earthworms, 2 amynthus genus and 1 Meadow genus, and they're pretty rough on an area when they invade. They can consume the litter layer, the organic matter in the soil more rapidly than earthworms. They change the soil structure, and they can decrease available nutrients for plants. And they get their name crazy jumping worm from the really aggressive, windy, twisty, jumpy behavior that they have when they're picked up, which makes them less likely to be eaten by predators. So when they take over and they exclude other less aggressive earthworms, there's less food for predators of earthworms because they have a harder time eating the crazy jumping worms. So they're definitely a bad species to have in an area. Unfortunately, there's
And Dan, is it confirmed? Is it confirmed? Sorry, is it confirmed that they're in Woodstock or in the area?
Anecdotally, I've heard people say that they found them in Woodstock, but when I checked the IMAP invasives database, they've been reported around Woodstock. And the IMAP invasives database is a national, now international database where people can report invasive species, and those reports are confirmed by experts. So if they're confirmed in the database, it means that an expert saw a photo of the record or visited the site and confirmed it as true. So while
can you get rid
it's around Woodstock, but it has, sorry?
How can you get rid of them? They want to know how. To get rid.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's just not a silver bullet for getting rid of any of the 3 species in the amynthus complex yet. you'll see a lot of people recommend a mustard mix solution. And what you can do is mix about a 2% solution of ground mustard seed with water and spray it on your yard, and it aggravates the jumping worms and forces them up onto the surface, and then you can pick them up, and you'll see their crazy response when you do it, and then you can put them in a bucket of water or vinegar or whatever you have on hand, or you can just bag them and leave the bag in the sun, and that's probably your best bet for reducing the population load on your property or in your garden space. But if they're in your garden, they're probably nearby, and so if you're spraying your garden and removing the worms from your garden, they're probably going to come from around, they're going to come from where they came from in the first place, right? So I'd say the best step is actually to prevent them from being introduced in the first place, which means keeping real close watch on where you get soil and fill and compost. Compost has to be heated to 100 degrees before it kills the earthworm cocoons. And you also have to be careful with planting and sharing plants, right? Because the soil that they come in can carry the earthworms too. So using bare root can really help reduce the risk. Not prevent it completely, but reduce it.
Thank you. Angela, this is a general question. I have a grass area about 30 by 20. I'd like a wildflower garden. What steps do I need to take?
30 by 20, and there's a number of different ways to start a meadow. 30 by 20 is probably doable with smothering, with newspaper and that sort of newspaper and cardboard. And what Dale had mentioned earlier with a once the I'm assuming it's an existing lawn, and they need to smother the lawn. And what Dale had mentioned earlier would be a fall dormant seeding. There's a lot of instructions on how to do that, step-by-step instructions on the pollinator-pathway.org website. And in fact, I just bought a book and I just received it today. It's by the same filmmaker who did Hometown Habitat and that Urban and Suburban Meadows. I haven't reviewed it yet, but that's supposed to be very good step-by-step, just more details. It kind of depends on how much detail they want. And I recommend researching it and doing and understanding as much detail as possible, because it's a fair amount of investment in your time and even resources for the seeds. So yeah, I would advise them to research it, and they'll probably, and there are different methods, and they'll probably end up with a smothering method and doing a fall dormant seeding for a, what is it, 20 by 30?
Yeah.
Was that the size? Okay.
Yes.
And again, go on the pollinator-pathway.org website, and there's lots of literature there on how to do that.
Dell, I have a question for you. I have periwinkle and daffodils planted in the front of my house. I'd like to add more plants that bloom throughout the seasons, preferably native. Can I just plant over the periwinkle without killing all of it and maintain it as a ground cover between the other plantings? Any plant suggestions? It's north facing, partial shade with clay soil.
Yeah, the periwinkle, I'm assuming that that is Vinca Minor is the botanical name, or sometimes called You know, but it's that's a Vinca Minor is a common ground cover. It has blue flower right now. It's in flower, and the daffodils, the narcissus, yeah, they can stay. You can work around those definitely. The Vinca Minor is an invasive, although it seems to be, you know, contained pretty easily. It's not like Pachysandra will take over, but Vinca is pretty manageable. It still puts out a pretty strong ground cover. So you have to really build it and watch the landscape if you're going to keep it in there. So those are both non-native plants that you have there. So putting as many native plants as possible that are shade tolerant would be really great. You also probably want to focus on deer resistance as well. So you know, there's a lot of things like ginger is a great one. I would go with actually plants that would put that like a woodland area. You know, trillium is in bloom right now, and I assume that it's somewhat deer resistant. They seem to stay away from it. But there's quite a number of them. Jacob's Ladder is another one that's pretty good on the partial shade area that you have. Geraniums are great. They're very deer resistant as well. You know, especially the wild geranium. There's some bleeding hearts that would do very well as in that area. Columbine is the early blooming one, and that would be a nice one to add to it. So you have to kind of decide, you know, how you want to do it, and if you do it in odd numbers, 3, 6, 3, 5, 7. You know, after you get about 7, you know, it could be whatever number you have, and just do them in clusters, you know, so it makes sense, and carry it through the landscape. So. Phlox is another one I would recommend as well. Ground cover phlox, and also I've had a lot of success with foam flower. That's a native one that's really pretty, and mixing both those foam flower and phlox together are really great, and they're great pollinator plants as well.
Thank you, Del. Ruth H., if you're still on, I know you had a similar question. If Del didn't answer it in this, please type me another question to follow up. Dan, this is a question. What are your views on Japanese knotweed?
Forgot to unmute myself for a second.
Yes.
It's a really aggressive, really common, widespread invasive plant, pretty much throughout the region. It's a really tough sell to get rid of it. I know it, you know, a lot of beekeepers really like it, but it just crowds out everything in riparian areas, and it can creep into lawns. It can destroy sidewalks, and it's a real nasty plant. And if you can get on top of it early, if it's not on your property yet, and you just see like 1 or 2 little shoots coming up, get rid of them as soon as you can, because once it's been there for a few years, you're going to have a heck of a time getting rid of it. As far as specifics go, we're trying to stay away from recommending herbicides on this podcast, or on this webinar. As far as mechanical controls go, some areas have seen some limited success suppressing populations with repeated cuttings, and I mean like multiple, 6, 8 times through the growing season, cutting it and laying the stalks down over top of the emerging stems. They found that they smother it. It's not going to be 100% by any means, because some of the stems are going to reroot right? Because it can reroot from stem fragments. Digging it up is, it can help to, reduce a population size, but the roots can sprout from root fragments. So you got to be really, really thorough about getting all the roots as well. The priority, I'd say, would be jumping on it early. And if you already have a large population on your property, focus on controlling the edges so it doesn't spread further.
Thank you, Dan. Angela, I'm going to weave two questions together. Someone asked the general question of where do you recommend I get seeds and any plants in particular to get, but I also wanted to weave in a second question, which was, I bought the bee-friendly meadow mix from Hudson Valley Seed Company. Is that okay to use?
It's interesting, we talked about that question yesterday, and initially I said Hudson Valley Seed Company, because they really specialized or started with vegetables, they don't focus on natives, but I looked them up and they do have, I didn't find their bee-friendly mix on their website, but I did find 3 mixes that are native mixes, and one's called an Eastern Pollinator Mix. Yeah, another one's called Northeast Native Mix, and then another one's called Pollinator Petal Patch. So those 3 mixes have native perennials, and I would recommend going with one of those. Again, I didn't see the bee-friendly mix to check the species on it. In general, even though they're not local, I tend to buy my seeds from Prairie Moon Nursery, and I've also bought seeds from Prairie Nursery. I've also bought seeds from Ernst, but Ernst is so big, you have to buy seeds by the pound. There are some local seed, but the reason why I end up going to the Midwest is because the Midwest has been at the seed production of native seeds, particularly meadow seeds and prairie seeds, for decades, because they started with prairie restorations decades ago. And the Northeast has only recently, in the last couple of decades, started producing these types of seeds. And the Northeast just doesn't have as many meadows as the Midwest has prairies. And it's unfortunate that it's not local, but it is what it is. So that's where I go. They have all the seeds that you can that I particularly need, and I'm trying to think. There's a couple other places I go to in Pennsylvania for seeds. One of them is Brandywine, and I can't think of. I'd have to think about it for another seed source. So
Thank you.
I want to. Can I add to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Ed. Yeah, go ahead, Del.
Yes, the Prairie Nursery is another one. Angela talked about the regional. It's always best to get local, as local, where the seeds come from are local to your region. But there are very, very good seed mixes from Prairie Nursery, and I've used them for a number of years for large meadows. And they've always been very successful, especially doing adornment seeding. So that's
right,
just
and Prairie Nursery is in the Midwest as well.
Yeah, it is.
They're in Wisconsin.
Let me add that on our website related to this project, which actually we are in the midst of migrating from, so we have a page now on the original pollinator path, pollinator-pathway.org, website, we have a /Woodstock, but we are now creating that same set of information on our own unique website, and we'll get that information out to everybody. But on the website is a lot of resources for some of these questions about what types of plants are recommended, or where might I buy seeds, or where might I get plants. I encourage everyone to use that as well as a resource. And then know that every Friday we do an email blast out with additional information, try to answer questions. So please make sure you're on our email list, and maybe at the end of this, Ellie, you can repeat your email for people to reach you. Dell, this is a question for you. Looking for a ground cover for a steep area with partial sun south facing that would be deer tolerant and flower.
It's sloping to the south, so it has a southern aspect, and you're looking for as a ground cover for the whole area.
Ground cover, yeah. Deer tolerant and flower.
Well, that's depending on the steepness of the slope, and I would again do a soil analysis and make sure that what kind of area is there erosion going on, and address those first, and then be able to add things that are really great. Or there's some of the Rudbeckias are really great. Brown-eyed Rudbeckia is one that I've recently become very enjoyed a lot, and it flowers for a long time in the fall. There's great just some of the other Rudbeckias as well. Although it depends on the deer, it could shift. Let me see, in terms of other ground covers in a sunny area. Let me think. Some of the ground covers that are really great are the bearded tongue is another one that's really great and it's pretty aggressive. It will take over. Also like Karen Edmond had talked about using the goldenrod is great, along with the asters and mountain mint, and are all great deer-resistant plants as well. So those would do well in the sunny area on the slope. So think of those as well.
Thank you. Dan, I have kind of two questions because one might be easy to answer. One is about the question of planting pollinator gardens near busy roads and parking lots. Is there a problem inviting bees and butterflies into a high traffic area? And that's question one. And then I'll follow it up with two people were asking about how to get rid of garlic mustard, besides making it into pesto. Okay.
That's mine.
Yeah, there was the first question for me.
The high traffic area, pollinators, attracting in a high traffic area.
Yeah, it can be a problem in that you're attracting lots of insects to an area that is also a risk space for them, right? Like if you're right next to a highway with a lot of traffic, you could get some bugs splattered on windshields. But I think having the pollinator space is better than having invasives there, right? Another potential source population, certainly. So I think if that's your only space to have a pollinator garden, it's better to have it there than to not have it there. As for the garlic mustard, it hand pulls pretty easily after rain when soil's moist. You can use a hand spade to dig it up. It is edible, so you can make a pesto from it. I prefer to grab it after or before it flowers.
Right, and it's flowering now, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Angela. Are there specific bee-friendly plants that don't need a deep bit of dirt to grow? In other words, if you're planting in an area, a bedrock area, must you have a deep raised bed?
It's kind of interesting because I was talking to, I think, Georgia about this a while ago, and I was looking for a plant list that with very thin soils and something, say, rock garden plant list, and I couldn't find anything on the pollinator-pathway website. So I went rooting around and I found some plant lists in Bill Kalina's books and made copies of them. And I'm going to forward those lists to you folks. And you could probably post those. And so the short answer is, I think if they work with a rock garden list, they can deal with shallow and drier soils. And
Okay.
and that's really, and the other thing too is, they're talking about bedrock. So I'm assuming that there's soil on the bedrock. It's not exposed bedrock, because if it were exposed bedrock, I would say take advantage of the rock and do something else with it. Don't put soil on it. But I'm assuming that there's soil on the rock.
Thank you. So we have 3 minutes and
I
we
would
have
wanna
probably
add
3
one-
more questions. Okay,
Okay.
I'm just, just to watch the time because we have 3 more questions, but go ahead, Del. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, just a quick, for rocky areas, I would use columbine. It's really great. It's also deer resistant, but it grows very, very well and spreads on rocky, steep slope area. So with virtually no soil almost, so. Go
All right,
ahead.
Del,
Back to you.
sorry. Del, this question's for you from our friend Gail. I have areas that are very wet until late April and then dry. Other areas are wet until July or August. What can be planted there?
First of all, I'm actually doing that. I suggested that to a client recently, just like last week. They had this huge roof area that they were going to somehow get it across the driveway. I suggested a rain garden, and we actually, the excavator was there building it, and we built a rain garden. So you have to size it according to the amount of water that's coming off the roof and direct it into the rain garden. The idea of a rain garden is it's a drainage area, but it's also a temporary wetland. So you have to have plants that are both wet, can tolerate wet and also dry. And if it's a shaded area, then you have to work with that. You have to plant the things that are shade tolerant. A lot of the sedges are really great, for that. Rushes are more, they need permanent water, but the sedges can take that kind of real moist and real dry, dry areas at times. Except Pennsylvania sedge, which is very low, needs more drier soils. Not all sedges, but a lot of beautiful sedges can be used, along with some other plants as well.
So Ellie, I see you there, and we have probably 2 more questions. Can we run over or not?
We absolutely can run over if everybody is willing to take a little extra time. That's fine.
Is that okay with all of our presenters? Yes? Okay. This is Dan. This is a question about mugwort, and when I read it, for me, this is a homeowner who might benefit from knowing about the Trees for Tribs program, but she said, I have a large riverfront area where mugwort has taken over. How can I plant some natives that will outcompete or probably compete the mugwort? would bearded tongue and mountain mint manage? I should invite her to Xena Cornfield to see our mugwort.
Yeah, they can stop by the Thorn Preserve and see some really prolific mugwort too. But actually, you mentioned trees for tribs, and both those sites are trees for tribs installation sites. Trees for Tribs is a program for people with riparian areas that are impacted by some sort of degradation, whether it's invasive species or erosion. Oftentimes it's multiple, right? And they provide site planning advice and plants, native plants, for you to place in that affected riparian area to help reestablish some ecosystem services in the area that may have been lost. And with mugwort, it's another really hardy plant. It's got really aggressive resprouting, really thick spreading rhizomes. Cutting the mugwort back repeatedly can induce some patchiness, or mowing repeatedly can induce some patchiness in it repeatedly over the growing season. Year after year after year, you might exhaust it, but it's actually it's resistant to some herbicides too, so like it's a real hardy plant. And I think your best bet is probably to shade it out if you can.
Yeah, or be in touch with us and we'll give you information on the DEC Trees for Tribs program. For Angela,
also,
what natives, oops, sorry, go ahead.
Xena Cornfield also did a Trees for Tribs. It's worth going and see that and see how mugwort was covering that whole riparian area. So, you know, go check that out. You can walk right up to it. See
So
all the
Angela,
tubes and everything.
what natives would you recommend to grow in large pots in a partial sun shade situation, i.e. sun for 3 to 4 hours and then dappled shade at other times? That's Angela. This is in pots.
Pots. I don't know. I'm gonna pass on that one because I am just not good with picking a particular species. What I do is I go with whole lists. I will say this, it makes a difference whether the sun, that 3 to 4 hours of sun, is morning or afternoon. If it's morning, as far as I'm concerned, it's a shade situation and dappled. But I'm going to pass on that, and maybe Dell would like to answer it.
Well, I did actually some planting there. I'm seeing how it looks. There's one called the sneezeweed, which is a beautiful plant that can be planted in a pot. It was actually a raised bed that we did out of stone. So it wasn't a completely container plant, but you probably could do that. So look that up. There's a lot of different varieties too. I think the native one is yellow, but there's also a ruby ruby red variety that's really exquisite. So, and deer resistant.
Well, I think Ellie, I think I got through all the questions. So Ellie, it's yours.
Thank you so much. First, I want to take a quick second to just thank all of our experts. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dell. And thank you, Maxanne, for moderating our question and answer session. I just want to give a quick reminder to everybody that we have a project website. It is pollinator-pathway.org/Woodstock. We are in the midst of redesigning a website, so when that is completed, we'll send you a wonderful, happy announcement to let you all know that we have wonderful new resources available on that new website. And this recording of this webinar will be archived on the Woodstock, New York Pollinator Pathway Facebook page. And I will be sending out an email to everybody who registered with that link where you can find the video probably tomorrow or the next day. And if anyone has any questions, wants to be added to our email list, those emails go out every Friday afternoon. You can send me a quick email at ellier.wlc@gmail.com, or you can also email Woodstock, New York Pollinator Pathway @gmail.com. I get those emails as well, so I can add you to the email list if you send your email to either one of those emails. I also put those email addresses, if you couldn't copy it down so quickly, in the chat box of the webinar here. So if you check over there, I'll leave that open for a second so everybody can take a look. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody who joined us for the conversation tonight. We really appreciate it. The Woodstock, New York Pollinator Pathway, as I said before, is a project of the Woodstock Land Conservancy, the Catskill Center, Woodstock Transition, Woodstock Environmental Commission, and community member partners, including Del Orlovsky, who joined us tonight. So I just want to thank everyone on our committee who has helped us plan events, who is helping us encourage everybody to create pollinator-friendly habitat in their own yards. And thank you to everyone who is planting up a storm. We are seeing little yard signs go up. Our map is getting filled up. On a regular basis, we're updating it. It's really exciting, and we really appreciate all the help, enthusiasm, and wonderful participation. So until the next time, everyone, have a great evening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.